Hi everyone! So by now you have probably seen the news about how the American Postal Service is being undermined in order to prevent our mail-in votes from counting in our upcoming November election, and you might rightfully be really angry and thinking, wow, this is horrible! What can I do to help? If so, you are in the right place, because today I'm going to talk about voter suppression and what you can do to help. There was a time in American history when you couldn't vote if you weren't a landowner, or were a black man, or a woman, or an indigenous person who lived in Arizona or New Mexico, or a person of Chinese ancestry, or a person who was in the military and lived in a base abroad, or live in Houston or Los Angeles or Milwaukee, or any of these other places in 2020. If your congressional district looks like a segment of Who's That Pokemon, your community is experiencing voter suppression. While I'm glad that we're focusing on our postal system and our voting rights, the problem is actually a lot deeper than that and has been around a lot longer than just the past few weeks. So before we can talk about any actions to make sure that anyone who has the right to vote is able to vote, we need to actually talk about what those barriers are. So, what does voter suppression look like in 2020? One of the most fundamental systems of voter suppression in the United States is actually how we conduct elections. Out of the 72 countries in the world that have elections, only 10 of them have elections on weekdays, and out of those 10, 3 have declared it a national holiday. So we are one of 7 countries in the world where a whole lot of people have to figure out how to vote around their work schedule. Another way we're experiencing voter suppression is that states are gutting their budgets for actually holding elections. This is something that's been going on for years. For example, in 2016, after the state cut the election budget, Maricopa County, which is where I spent my adolescence, had to cut their polling locations by 70%. They went from having 200 polling locations all over the county to having just 60 locations, which meant that one polling location was available for 21,000 people. And this is happening all over the country. The 2020 primary election began with this really faulty app that they used in the Iowa caucus. Then a month later, voters were standing in line for hours and hours and hours because there weren't enough polling locations for everybody. In Milwaukee in April, voters stood, and this is again, like we're in the middle of a pandemic here, voters in Milwaukee stood in a hailstorm wearing masks, trying to vote at one of 5 polling locations in all of Milwaukee. Any other year, they would have had 180 polling locations, and they cut them down to 5. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has done research on who these polling closures actually impact, and they found that, on average, a black voter is going to wait 45% longer than a white voter, and a Latina voter is going to wait 46% longer than a white voter. So the reduction of polling locations is disproportionately affecting black folks and Latina folks in our country. Number 3. Just straight up election tampering. Brian Kemp, who is the current governor of Georgia, ran against Stacey Abrams in 2018 while he was the Secretary of State of Georgia, which meant that he was basically in charge of the election that he was running in, and when he had the ability to tamper with the election, he did. His office wrongly notified 300,000 people that they were ineligible to vote, which was a lie, and his office also delayed the registration paperwork for about 53,000 voters. 80% of the people that were affected by this were Black, Latina, or Asian. And people knew that this was happening, so when they contacted the election officials saying like, hey, what are you doing? Their response was to say that, well, technically we're not really breaking any rules because even though we sent you a letter saying that you were ineligible to vote, you could have just come to a polling place anyway and we would have let you vote. Even though we told you that you shouldn't bother coming because you won't be able to vote, you could have tried. They straight up gave everybody the JBC treatment, like, maybe you should have tried harder. And finally, number 4, voter suppression looks like what's happening with the American Postal Service and the accompanied propaganda that's attacking the efficacy of mail-in voting. The gist of it is that our president appointed a person to be in charge of the USPS who is a stockholder in UPS, which is a private company that is a competitor to our public service mailing system. and that person has been sabotaging our mail. Mail is getting delayed on purpose, systems are getting jammed on purpose, mailboxes are being removed from neighborhoods. Like, it's crazy. As of this morning when I'm recording this, which is August 17th, Monday, the House has proposed to come back in session, and the Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, he's being called to testify in front of Congress to kind of answer for like, what is all this that's going on. And I do also want to speak to the propaganda against the efficacy of mail-in voting, because I currently live in a state that exclusively does mail-in voting and has found it to be very successful and have a generally high voter turnout compared to other states. Hawaii recently had their first all mail-in voting because of the pandemic, and they found, I think it was like a 7 or 8% increase in voter turnout. It was just a much more accessible way. So there's a ton of propaganda going on right now about how like mail-in voting is gonna create all this voter fraud and it's not gonna be a fair election. There's literally like zero evidence that mail-in voting increases fraud. That's just not true. So all this leads us to a very natural question. I mean, it seems like there's so many barriers to prevent people who are legally allowed to vote from actually being able to do so. Why? And I'm going to answer that question with a question. Do our policies align with what a majority of Americans want? For example, 70% of Americans support Medicare for all. Do our policies align with that? 74% of Americans support DACA, which would give a path to citizenship for undocumented folks who were brought to the US as kids. Do our policies align with that? 66% of Americans support a wealth tax. Do our policies align with that? So if a majority of Americans of any political affiliation seem to agree on these fundamental things that would really improve the quality of all of our lives, why don't we actually have them as policies? Who benefits from voter suppression? Now, I can't answer that question because that's like a whole nother conversation, but I wanted to ask you that question because as you try to answer the question of who benefits from voter suppression, I think it will give you some clarity on actions and commitments that you can take that really resonate with what your values are. You should vote for the same reason that you should wear a mask or be socially distant from folks. It's your civic duty and it's the right thing to do. But please also remember that the ability to vote itself isn't something that many Americans can do. Americans who have a legal right to vote are not able to vote because of voter suppression. So if you're somebody who's feeling jaded or frustrated thinking that your vote doesn't matter, it's not that your vote doesn't matter, it's because your community is experiencing voter suppression. Because if everyone who could vote was able to vote, then our policies would align a lot more with what a majority of Americans want. And saying that that's why it's even more important to vote is missing the point. We are and have been in a situation where the act of voting itself is under attack. So having a blind faith in it as the sole or a primary mechanism of change is backwards thinking. We have to pay attention to how voting is being rendered impotent in our communities and take action. One way you can do this is by advocating for Election Day to be a national holiday. Holidays are created by Congress, so your congressional representative would be the person to reach out to about this. If you're feeling brave, you can give them a call, but an email is also fine. And you can find the information for your congressional representative at house.gov. Another way that you can help is by signing up to be a poll worker. Right now there's a huge poll worker shortage, and that's making some counties consolidate their voting locations because there's just not enough people to run them. The more poll workers there are, the more polling locations we can have, which means shorter lines for everybody and more geographical access. Also, a majority of poll workers are over 60 years old, probably because our elections are always on a Tuesday, and they are at a higher risk for coronavirus in the middle of this pandemic, so you would really be helping out in so many ways. If you can, please sign up to be a poll worker. If you are interested, I'm going to leave a link below in the description box, which will give you some more information on how you can sign up. Now, I did a lot of research before I made this video, and I understand everyone doesn't have the capacity to just be constantly doing research all the time. So I would highly encourage you to follow these organizations on Twitter. This way you can stay informed and know how to get involved with local advocacy. Whether it's protesting or making phone calls or donating money, These organizations have been working really hard for a very long time, so being in the loop of actions that they recommend would be the best. So if you're like, I wish I could do something, they'll tell you what to do. And finally, please continue asking yourself who benefits from voter suppression. Finding out what voter suppression looks like in your community at a local level is really going to have a huge impact, and it's going to help you take some of that frustration that you might be feeling and channel it into a direct action. Like I mentioned, as you try to answer that question, I think you will find ways that resonate with you and inspire action and commitments that you can make to fight voter suppression in your community. Finding out what voter suppression looks like in your community and taking any of the actions that I just mentioned is going to have a huge impact. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!